Justice. Today's conversation is one of several signature events as a part of our 7th annual Black Reproductive Justice Week of Action. My name is Lexi White, and I am the Director of State Policy and Advocacy at In Our Own Voice, National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda. We are a national and state partnership of Black reproductive justice organizations across the country whose work centers the experiences of Black women, femmes, girls, and gender-expansive people in the ongoing policy fight to secure reproductive justice for all. This year, the focus of our Week of Action is the Black Reproductive Justice Policy Agenda, an agenda to shift policy and change culture. And this week, In Our Own Voice and our supporters, as well as our state-based partners and policy agenda contributors, are engaging our legislators and communities around the Black reproductive justice policy agenda and key policy priorities that impact the lives of Black women, femmes, girls, and gender-expansive individuals. Our framework envisions policy change that is intersectional, that holds the fullness of our experiences of political and social marginalization, including attempts to control our decision-making about our bodies, about pregnancy and parenting, and our access to basic reproductive health services, including abortion care, and to keep us from being able to exercise our most fundamental voting rights to ensure our voices and the needs of our communities are heard. These are rights that any equitable democracy must protect. 98% of Black women voted in the 2020 presidential election, and 76% feel the Black community has a real power to change the outcome of elections. Similarly, 92% of Black women voters believed it's extremely important to vote for candidates who support pregnant people making their own decisions about their reproductive health. Today is the anniversary of the passage of the Hyde Amendment, a racist attempt to undercut our access to equitable coverage for abortion care and to circumvent the precedent that Roe v. Wade has set. It is also a time when we are seeing the aftermath of a racist administration play out in the states through voter suppression laws that resemble the Jim Crow era and through targeted regulation attacks against abortion providers and clinics and the critical care they provide. Our communities suffer as a result, and we need lawmakers at every level to get this right. I am honored and excited to introduce you to our wonderful panelists today who will help to lay the groundwork for how these issues are playing out at the state and federal level. Today we'll hear from Edwith Theogene, who's the Advocacy Director of Generation Progress. You will also hear from Lauren Bealore, who is the Director of Democracy with the State Innovation Exchange, also known as SIX. And you will hear from State Representative Kim Schofield of Georgia's 60th District in the House of Representatives. You will also hear from my colleague, Carmen Alexander, who is the Deputy Director of Operations at New Voices for Reproductive Justice. I'd like to begin by posing a few questions to Edwith. Edwith, can you help us level set by telling us about the policy landscape to advance the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the For the People Act, and trends you're seeing in the national and state landscape in your work to protect voting rights for all communities?
Yeah, happy to. Thank you so much, Lexi, for having me, and thank you to In Our Own Voice and all of the different state partners. I'm happy to be here. So there's been a lot of stuff happening across the community. So I just want to backtrack. Let's start from like November 2020. So in November 2020, you highlighted some really key points there, Lexi, that 98% of Black women voted. And in November, we all demonstrated our immense electoral power, despite targeted voter suppression efforts and challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic, economic shutdown, all of these things that were happening. So nationwide, the 2020 presidential election turnout was about 7% higher than in 2016. And at Generation Progress, we work with 18 to 29-year-olds. So as far as like youth electoral turnout, between 18 to 29, there was also an 11 points higher turnout than the 2016 election. So it's one of the highest rates of youth electoral participation since the voting age was lowered to 18. And a big factor for this turnout was the dramatic steps that many states took to expand mail balloting and early voting because of the pandemic. So now, fast forward to present day, we are witnessing a massive coordinated effort to suppress our votes. Across the country, we're seeing our access to the ballot box being limited. According to the Brennan Center, more than 400 bills with provisions that restrict voting access have been introduced in 49 states in the 2021 legislative sessions. A lot of our folks who are watching this right now, you are on the front lines of this and see this happening throughout your communities. These laws make mail voting and early voting more difficult. They impose harsher voter ID requirements, and they also make faulty voter purges more likely, among other things. So these bills are aimed at preventing young voters, low-income voters, voters of color, Black voters in particular, from making their voices heard. So that's happening in the legislative sessions and the state houses across the country, but let's not also forget what we see happening in the courts. This year, on June 25th, marked 8 years since the Shelby v. Holder decision, where SCOTUS effectively gutted the Voting Rights Act by ending federal review requirement for any attempts to discriminate against voters. And then on top of that, the 8 years, this past July, SCOTUS upheld an Arizona discriminatory voting law and weakened Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act to make future challenges against anti-voter laws even more difficult. So that further compounded the damage done to Shelby v. Holder. And then there's so much more I can also say in terms of the landscape, because we can't also forget about redistricting. State and local officials are now beginning the processes of redrawing the boundaries of congressional, state, legislative, and local government districts. These maps determine how we will be represented, how funds for schools, hospitals, and essential services will be allocated. So these new district maps should give each of our votes equal weight and each of our voices equal stature and each of our communities equal resources. But unfortunately, a handful of politicians have divided us into districts that serve their political interests instead of our community needs. And they're doing that again this year. We see that happening in Ohio, where they recently just approved the final district maps. And the vote was along party lines, and it basically guarantees a Republican supermajority for the next 4 years. And then in Georgia, Governor Kemp has called for a special session to redraw Georgia's political map. And this puts Georgia's Republican majority in charge of the state's political boundaries, giving them the ability to basically draw districts that could gain them a seat in the US House and preserve their dominance in the General Assembly. I mean, all of it's racist, right? Like, I can't even further explain that, because basically all it does is keep those who are in power, and it continues to, we're seeing just basically a chipping away of our freedom to vote, our right to vote, and how we vote. So Lexi, you're asking about what are some of the key legislations and policy solutions to kind of respond to this. And there are a couple of bold policy solutions that advocates have long been fighting for. And these solutions give us right now in this moment a unique opportunity to fix the problems in our democracy and give the will of the voters a bigger role in deciding US public policy. So the first one I just want to hit up is the For the People Act, which is in both the House and the Senate, S1 in the Senate and HR1 in the House. And this is a transformative package to realize the promise of our democracy. It gets big money out of politics, it ensures our freedom to vote, and guarantees that congressional districts are drawn to give fair representation for all. So the US passed the House, the House passed the For the People Act in March 2021, and the Senate was hard at work to try to move this legislation as well. But in June and August 2021, Senate Republicans used the filibuster, which I know we'll talk about later in this conversation, and other tools to basically block the bill from even being debated. So Senate Democrats continue to remain united in the debate on this historic legislation, and advocates continue to come together and to put pressure on Congress to act, right? Like the House has already done their job and already passed sweeping legislation to protect our freedom to vote. So on September 14th, the Senate responded to this pressure and introduced the Freedom to Vote Act, which is the other bill I'd also like to highlight. The Freedom to Vote Act is revised legislation that basically upholds most of the key pillars of the For the People Act. It's only been introduced in the Senate. It's another transformative bill that would go a long way toward protecting the right to vote and preserving our democracy. It contains a lot of the many popular and much needed provisions from the For the People Act, and it would essentially do what we need to happen, which is strengthen voting rights, stop partisan gerrymandering, and reduce the influence of big money in politics. Leader Schumer has said that this is a top priority for the Senate, so we're expecting a vote to happen on it any day now in the Senate, and Senate Republicans have already been vocal and said that they remain opposed to voting on this bill. So we'll see what happens. And then lastly, the other big major bill that we have is the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which is in the House, we call it HR 4. And this bill would restore and strengthen our freedom to vote by making sure that any changes to voting rules that could discriminate against voters based on their race, background are federally reviewed, so we all have an equal say in our future. So this bill would essentially restore the key protections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which I talked about earlier, that SCOTUS had gutted this bill. And the John Lewis Voting Rights Act would help to address all of that damage from the Supreme Court gutting the bill, and is really a great bill that a lot of people support. As you notice, it's named after Georgia Representative and Civil Rights activist John Lewis, who dedicated his life to fighting for the right of every American to be able to vote free from racial discrimination. So it's also named in his honor to reflect all of the great work that he's done. So I'll just stop there, Lexi, and see if there's any other questions. But yeah, we have some solutions, but we're also in a dumpster fire.
Absolutely. And thank you for highlighting those bills. I want viewers to know that the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the For the People Act are a part of the Black RJ policy agenda. And as a part of this year's Week of Action, we do have some active action alerts running on blackwomen'srj.org. So we encourage folks to take a look at those. But Edwith, I want to follow up to your point on the filibuster. Congress has the opportunity to pass voting rights reform, but with the current structure of the Senate, a lot of these bills, are sadly, we continue to encourage support, but are sadly not all that likely at times to reach a 60 vote threshold. There's been some discussions about reforming the filibuster and acknowledging its racist history. What are your thoughts on this and how it also connects to, the struggle to advance reproductive rights that we're fighting for?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And you're totally right, Lexi. A lot of people have been having tons of conversations around the filibuster, and there are a lot of differing opinions as well. In short, the filibuster is I just want to kind of define it a little bit for folks, but in short, the filibuster is a procedural tool that senators use to delay or block action on a bill they don't like. And essentially, the filibuster undermines majority rule and defies democracy by allowing a minority of 41 senators to block a bill from ever receiving a vote. This is what we've seen come into play as it pertains to in the Senate for the People Act. And the thing about the filibuster is that it does have a complicated history, because in the past it was used as a tool to protect Jim Crow laws, particularly by blocking anti-lynching and anti-poll tax legislation. And at times it was also used as a tool to promote compromise and debate on issues such as busing and abortion, as long as the Senate minority were working in good faith in the majority. So right now in our current landscape, there just seems to be so much opposition within Congress that it makes it really difficult for progress to happen. So we're continuing to demand action on voting rights, gun violence prevention, healthcare expansion, shrinking the criminal legal system, economic justice, immigration justice, climate justice, all of the things. But in our current political landscape with the filibuster in place, the policy solutions to these pressing issues are just blocked. Like, we can't even start debate and have conversations around them. We don't even know where people stand on these issues because we're such a stalemate. So many organizations and advocates are supporting broad reform of the filibuster to allow majority vote. My organization is one of them, the Center for American Progress and Generation Progress. We believe in reforming the filibuster, but it is something that a lot of people feel some type of way about, which makes sense because of the complicated history and stuff. But to your point also, Lexi, about blocking legislation around reproductive rights, Like, as we saw recently, the Women's Health Protection Act just passed the House, which is really extraordinary, but it can't even go past the Senate to even start debate because of the filibuster, because there's strong opposition from the minority party.
Thank you, Edwith, for drawing that connection. And I want us to continue, as we move through this conversation, to really, think about the intersection of, state lawmakers who are making it their business at the state level to push reproductive health care out of reach for marginalized communities. It's oftentimes happening in the very same states where we're seeing these targeted attacks against our right to cast the ballot. And we know as advocates that's not a coincidence. I want to therefore shift a little bit to state landscape and introduce Lauren Bealore, who is the Director of Democracy with the State Innovation Exchange. Lauren, can you tell us about your work to activate and support Black women voters and your work with the State Innovation Exchange and its Democracy Champions cohort?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me today. So I'll start with our Democracy Champions cohort, which is really what I like to call the heart and pulse of the work that we do at State Innovation Exchange, because it really is the core engagement of the legislators within our network for democracy. And when legislators transition into elected office, the democracy team within SIX has always been committed to working with our 6 state directors within our priority states to engage them immediately into our 6 programming and build tangible relationships as the foundation of a long-term relationship of building progressive power. And by doing so, we organize our programming through a collaborative system of on-the-ground state-level support, national issue area expertise, and research and communication services. And we continue to engage legislators through trainings, webinars, briefings, and communications opportunities as a relationship building tool, but also to build legislators up as specific policy experts. And our significant touch points have come through many of our issue areas, which range, but there are a few top priority issue areas, which is our defensive democracy work, redistricting, and criminal justice reform. But with that being said, we also really identify a lot of trends that are taking place, and through some of the work that I've done in my role, that is where Black women legislator engagement has really come into play. Through a co-led partnership with Nobel Women, we have launched back in March our No Democracy Without Black Women project. And this project was created as a national campaign to address the dramatic underrepresentation, and I repeat, dramatic underrepresentation of Black women in state legislatures across the country, with both SIX and Nobel Women's work emphasizing state government as a way to bring about progressive and equitable policy that protects our democracy. This project, which of course, again, launched in March, has been a great way to highlight the work that elected Black women have done to fill in these gaps for their communities, as well as recognize the support and investment needed to grow the pipeline of Black women legislators. So we did this through a 50-state analysis in the personal lens of several current and former state legislators. And the project was able to capture really the essence of a Black woman's experience within the political landscape, both historically and really in present times. And with the use of the 50-state data analysis, we were able to capture targeted states of limited representation based on demographic focused populations of Black women per each state. And I will definitely share links to that in the chat. But in addition to the scope of highlighting this underrepresentation, we also wanted to highlight the implications on progressive and equitable policy implementation that would benefit Black and Brown communities the most. This project was launched, of course, to feed into the services for our democracy program at SIX and also the program and membership through Nobel Women, but also to support Black women legislators and give them a network as well. You know, it is very crucial for Black women to be represented in state legislatures, which consider over 100,000 bills nationwide each year. The people who most intimately know the true impact of structural racism and sexism are Black women. And they know best how to dismantle those systems and move to a more just and equitable democracy in society. So that moves me into another program area of expertise, which is redistricting. And as Edwith mentioned, that has been a high priority. It was very much recognized as we moved out of a major census year. And so in December of 2020, we launched an initial project through SIX with interest in specifically the Florida redistricting landscape. And understanding that that would be on the horizon in 2021, we did some in-depth research and analysis of Florida that was used as a roadmap for redistricting analysis, and then worked and connected with partners such as Campaign Legal Center, All on the Line, the National Redistricting Action Fund, and the Southern Coalition for Social Justice to host a national redistricting webinar this past June for state legislators. And it really focused on messaging around redistricting, also looking at the race component and racial components of redistricting, and how the redistricting is not inclusive of communities of interest. And that also led into identifying another potential trend, which would be redistricting in public health. A lot of times and many times when we talk about redistricting, we do not talk about how it intertwines or intersects with other policy issues. And in partnership with our Repro team, we decided to do in-depth analysis and put together a research one-pager for legislators to use, uplift, and push this out throughout state legislatures and help with bill reform. Redistricting reforms being considered across state legislatures in this country this fall, which include Arizona, Florida, and North Carolina, will show that unfair redistricting practices such as gerrymandering exacerbate disparities in public health outcomes. And while fair and equitable redistricting has the potential to help communities better address inequities in public health, it does not fare to include reproductive and maternal health as well as the well-being of that. So we highlighted a lot of the research already out there that looks at structural racism as a public health crisis, redistricting and representation, which was through the Center for American Progress. Of course, our No Democracy Without Black Women report. Also how partisan gerrymandering limits access to healthcare, and evaluating priorities of reproductive rights and public health, and also looking at how ending prison gerrymandering is relative to redistricting and also the public health implications as well. So that's kind of a brief overview of some of the ways that we've engaged with state legislators, and also how we're looking at trends and identifying trends, in addition to much of our defensive democracy work, which I will walk into as well.
Thank you, Lauren. And how can supportive legislators get involved with the cohort?
So definitely sign up, and I can also include a link in the chat. But in addition to not only getting involved with our Democracy Champions cohort, but also just getting involved around many of the policy issues that are on the forefront at the moment. With redistricting, we would encourage lawmakers to just be as vocal as possible to encourage community engagement and really push an emphasis around communities of interest. And being a part of the redistricting process, calling out unfair and inaccessible map-making processes. States are already kicking off redistricting with lack of transparency. North Carolina, Georgia, Ohio, and that's just mainly on the state level, but also congressional road mapping has started to take place, Texas, Georgia, to help pick up seats. So it's very important to outline how that's happening. There are not enough hearings taking place, not enough planning of community hearings once maps are released. So this is another way to do that as well. And there's not been much virtual participation in redistricting hearings. So it's very important that state legislators really continue to use their platform and lead on emphasizing some of these battles that are taking place. Also too, recognizing that these trends and the coordinated attacks are happening across regions, and it's very important to show how that aligns. Also, too, it's also important, and this is relative to this overall theme of the conversation today, to show the overlap between states where we're seeing voter suppression laws passed and states that are introducing targeted regulation attacks against abortion providers and access. As we all know, and it's no secret, the roadmap and coordination that typically happens with GOPs on the state level, federal level, always happen in tandem. And so it's really important to show how that happens, because a voter is not necessarily going to think in that mind frame, and a legislator can help to frame it and set that mindset and show how that's taking place. So that's just a few things that can happen. A few other ways that legislators can get involved that we provide through SIX is also writing op-eds. There are press opportunities as well, collaborative and joint messaging, which elevating the freedom to vote messaging that has been pushed out since earlier this year is a great way to do that. There's been messaging through redistricting, messaging around the For the People Act. Also, too, our SIX Action Arm released a series of 5 video ads featuring state legislators on the front lines of anti-voter battles who are making the case for federal voting standards. And the videos align with the constituents for DFAD, which is the Declaration for American Democracy, and it's located on their Take Action page. And some of those states are Arizona, Florida, Michigan, North Carolina, and Tennessee. So that is also another way to get involved, amplifying messaging and building out and sharing the narrative. There's also opportunities for legislators to tell their personal narrative. Many legislators are a part of the demographic or represent the communities that are being attacked. So there's a way to show how a legislator is personally impacted as a voter. A legislator is a voter. And so, they are not exempt from being attacked by the same laws that they tend to have to fight against every single day. And sometimes people do not correlate that narrative. And it's really important to see a legislator as a voter as well, and not just as someone who enacts and pushes out legislation and laws. So that's another way that legislators can get involved. I know I could go on and on about that, but I want to be graceful of time.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for sharing about your work and offering all this expertise. Even today, right, the House Committee on Oversight and Reform in the federal space is hosting a hearing, that's examining the threat to abortion access by extreme anti-abortion state legislators, and equally as hostile to voting rights at the Supreme Court level, a Supreme Court that is hostile to reproductive rights and justice. And as we have folks in our movement today testifying at this hearing in support of things like the Women's Health Protection Act and putting an end to all coverage barriers to abortion healthcare, including the Hyde Amendment, we need to continue to encourage legislators to take action on these items together at the state level. And to where possible, codify state protections for reproductive health care. And so with that in mind, I'll add to that, some of the hypocrisy we continue to highlight is that, these so-called pro-life and pro-family politicians have done, in many cases, virtually nothing to help end the maternal mortality crisis that continues to harm Black women and families. And we could say the same for many conservative legislators, in the Deep South. We've been seeing what's playing out in Texas. We could say the same for Georgia. And we are, very honored to have State Representative Kim Schofield of District 60 in Georgia with us today. Representative Schofield, wanted to get your take on how attacks on voting rights and reproductive justice have been playing out in the Georgia legislature and across the state, and what the impact has been for Black women in marginalized communities.
Well, thank you, Lexi, and thank you, everyone, Edwith and Lauren. Lauren from 6. Thank you for this opportunity. I am State Representative Kim Schofield. And, the first question you ask is, how has it played out? Look at where we are today. It's played out in a way where not only did we awake a sleeping giant, we have now become a strong voice across the nation. And so when we cannot separate one from the other, let's call it what it is. Georgia is now Jim Crow 2.0, has always been, but now we have seen the impact of this election that has really showed us who we are and where we are going. And having said that, our legislative body, as we are in the minority, has been able to shape the whole nation. And we know in the 2020 election, Georgia became a focal point in the discussion on voter rights. And we know that reproductive justice was a big factor in our legislative session. What Georgia has continually tried to do was to silence the voice of Black women and marginalize us in communities. And what we have been successful in doing is we shift that focus, and we showed up at the polls and we voted. And so Black women now carry the state of Georgia, and we will continue to do so. One of the things that is just really interesting to me is how they use the same playbook on us. And so that playbook continues to consist of, let's silence the voice. Let's make them believe that they have no power in their vote. Let's use fear tactics. Let's marginalize the communities and make it hard for them to vote, since we can do that and do things like, shortening the window to apply for a mail-in ballot. We especially to voters that have no access or limited access to being able to get to vote, i.e. jobs. You're not given the amount of time to go vote on your particular job, limiting the number of locations and the availability of the drop-off boxes, imposing harsher voter requirements for mail-in voting. I mean, the most ridiculous thing is banning snacks and water for voters waiting in line, limiting early voting hours. And these are just to name a few. So when you ask, how does voting impact RJ? It's if we can silence the voice of the women, if we can pull them back, if we can stop that and shut it down, then we will not be able to make an influence and impact and protect our voting and our reproductive rights. So Georgia legislators have stepped up to say, it's not just about the saying we're not going to take this anymore. We've aligned with organization advocacy groups to say we can do better. Now we have a governor that is always going to appeal to his base. And that's where we have to get stronger in making sure we're electing people, and especially in the governor's race, that align with our vision. We need to, as Georgia legislators and legislators across the state, is to really align with your advocates and really force the legislators to come out and be more vocal and take that stance. Now, again, Georgia, we can scream all day long, but the action has to come from the voice of the advocates. So we are actively know that there's been an attack. We've seen what's happened last week. We stand with the abortion bill coming back to Georgia, and we are standing and have some strategies that we're working in place and in tandem to make sure that we can stop and shut this down. I think the most thing that we need to know as progressive leaders is that the power of our voice is in a collective body, and everybody has a role to play, and we've got to step up. You've got to go back to your legislators and ask, and I would say align with, there's got to be a strategic alignment. And if we can do some things perfect, we'll at least make an impact. It's not going to be a one and done. It's not a one size fits all. I think we just have to be intentional and strategic on how we move that needle by showing up. And legislators have to stand up front and start being afraid. We've got to be bolder, bigger, better right now in this moment. We can do it. If you look at the voting states, and you look at the number of African American women that have come out. We've got to empower them to show up. We've done it before, we can do it again. And I thank all of you that stand on the forefront of paving the way for us to come in and do what we do. On the outside, you control that space. You control some of the narratives. You feed us to get us to push and pull. And we've got to do more pulling than we are pushing.
Thank you, Representative Schofield. One follow-up question I have is, in a place like Georgia has had to be so on the defensive with all of these legislative attacks we've seen. Can you give us some insight on what some like proactive policy ideas might be for legislators to actually, promulgate support for voting rights in their state, knowing that we can get it done, even as we are, fighting off these attacks, and how can we kind of model those proactive efforts in other states where we have a strong base of support?
Yeah, I mean, again, Georgia State, we don't have filibusters. There are things that we just can't do. We don't get our bills moved to the floor. So, we've got to put the pressure on some of the people across the aisles because we are their constituents in those districts. We also have to get and empower, when you say legislation, we are looking at progressive legislation that across the state to protect voter rights and reproductive justice. We've had bills for maternal health. We've had all bills. We've got on the House side, we have at least 16 voter bills, reproductive bills that have come through. You will never hear about them because we're not getting them to get a hearing. So, in Georgia, it's the voice of the advocates that have to start rallying and bringing more people. We legislatively, when you demand of people across the aisles to start doing something, we have to find people in those districts. We have to get people to run in those districts against to develop that thing. The Georgia House is really a very limited House and Senate. We cannot get legislation to the ground. So even the best policies in other states that are strong policies are not going to fly. What is it underground that we can do? And that's where we look to you and to hold your legislators to have those conversations. It's not that we're not doing enough or we're not doing. You have to understand the playing field that we have. And on the outside, you have the power to drive us, to push us, to come back and say, this is what they said, this is what we want, and we're not going to let it stop until we get it. And so we're, let me give you a clear picture. We are not even given time in the well now because this has become charged. So our voice has to be in the streets. When you can't get inside the House or the Senate, you've got to take it to the streets. And our coalitions have to be stronger, bigger, bolder, and they have to spread not in Metro Atlanta, but in the outer lying markets or districts in Atlanta. Redistricting is going to try to marginalize us further and divide us. And so while, we had hearings across the state, that was just a formality. But RJ is the voice of the women, and we do this well. I've seen it done before. We knew that we used to show up at our Capitol, call out your legislators. The narrative, I think Lauren said, the resources with 6 have to push the legislators that are afraid to step out. You've got to put that pressure.
And I love that as someone, who believes fully in the power of mobilizing and community organizing. I love that quote, when you can't get to the House, you got to take it to the streets. You have to take it directly to the community. And that really is what Black RJ Week of Action is all about, and why we want to encourage our supporters to plug into this movement and join the fight to hold our elected leaders accountable to these issues and to spread the word in the community. And that is something that I want to talk about deeper with another expert that we have on the call, my colleague from Pennsylvania and Ohio, who is the Chief of Staff and Deputy Director of Operations at New Voices for Reproductive Justice. who has a multi-state integrated voter engagement program that is activating Black women, femmes, and gender expansive folks around reproductive justice issues and their voting rights. And so Carmen, can you tell us a little bit about how integrated voter engagement has been used as a movement building strategy and tactic to advance reproductive justice in the Rust Belt region?
Yes, thank you, Lexi, for having me on this program. Thank you, In Our Own Voice. The RJ Week of Action has been amazing and informative, and every year I enjoy it, so thank you. So yeah, how the integrating voter engagement is activating our organization through the Rust Belt. First, let me just give you a little bit of information about just New Voices in general and the work that we're doing in the Rust Belt. New Voices is a reproductive justice and human rights and reproductive justice advocacy organization. We have a mission to build a social change movement dedicated to the health and full well-being of Black women, girls, femmes, and girls in Pennsylvania and Ohio. New Voices has a very robust integrated voter engagement program, and it's called Voice Your Vote. We're currently working in Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and Philadelphia areas. We have hired over 30 people from our communities on a part-time basis to work as door canvassers and phone bankers. And we have two amazing Voice Your Vote organizers who manage this process. And I'm proud of our Voice Your Vote team that we have a higher than average contact rate. We aim to connect to like 10% of the people we call, and we're about 3% higher than that. So I'm really happy for that work. Our Voice Your Vote program connects voting to RJ issues. It's a lot of the opposition doesn't see the two, but as we have discussed and heard all this week, that that reproductive issues are directly connected to our voting. So we continuously engage our voting constituencies on these issues so they can vote based on their lived experiences. And we hold our legislators accountable once they're in office. We help to plan rallies, educational sessions, and actions. We also keep an eye out for voter suppression laws like limiting ballot boxes and voter registration, also restrictions. And we continue to educate our base so we can make sure that they have the resources they need to get to the polls. We also work with state legislators to advance the RJ issues. And we're on our local cohorts to address issues like environmental justice, abortion access, Black maternal health issues, prison reform, and healthcare access. Today we have a virtual PA in Ohio RJ briefing to engage and educate our legislators on key RJ policy issues. And we also sign on to RJ related amicus briefs. Our voter engagement includes our door-to-door and community canvassing, as well as connecting by phone, mail, through mobilizing our voters to the polls. We want to encourage them to take action through the year and legislative sessions and issues that they care about. So we practice this in a 3-touch method. We call folks, we door canvass, we distribute flyers, hangers, door hangers and flyers during an election cycle. We reach out to Black women ages 18 to 49 that are who have a low voting record. We aim to make all of our voters super voters. We want them to come to elections every election, not just the general elections. For example, the past Ohio special election only had about a 15% turnout, and that proves that our work is not only important, but it's critical. We can't sleep on voting. We can't just rest in between each cycle. We have to continually engage and push the needle. New Voices turns out about 81% of our voters with these methods. 82% of Black women voters registered in Philadelphia County voted in 2020. Black voters turned out in general was about 64%. So Black women and New Voices voters turned out in higher rates than among Black people. As we had said earlier, that Black women votes matter. We continually show up. The Black turnout in Philly was about 65.3% in Allegheny County and was 60.29%. And Allegheny County was 60.29%. So basically, Black women voters are more active by 15 to 20% points. We're working on leadership models that will empower Black women and gender expansive folks to create cohorts that will champion RJ issues and to take our issues to the polls. to vote for legislators who will support RJ issues. Black women turnout is so well in Pennsylvania that it changed the course of the entire 2020 election. It was a huge victory and a reward for our Voice Your Vote program.
Thank you so much, Carmen, for sharing. And just to help us kind of get the regional legislative landscape in Pennsylvania and Ohio, what does the landscape for voting rights and reproductive justice look like in both states? And what opportunities do you see for reform?
Certainly. While we have some wonderful legislative champions in support of our issues in both Pennsylvania and Ohio, the policy landscape can still be hostile towards our communities. Some of those things were named here, and I'll go through a few of them. They are hostile towards our communities, both towards our ability to vote without interference and with regards to our reproductive rights. The rates of, for example, the rates of Black maternal mortality in Ohio are more than 2.5 times higher for Black women than they are for our white counterparts. In Philadelphia, PA, Black women were counted as in 73% of pregnancy-related deaths. That is so ridiculous, 73% of pregnancy-related deaths. We are working with legislative champions and both legislators to advance legislation to remedy this epidemic. We have been advocating for legislation to ensure severe maternal morbidity is included in the list of reportable events within the Department of Health. We also want to extend Medicaid coverage for pregnancy and related postpartum and medical assistance. We want to extend Medicaid coverage to doula services and create a doula advocacy board. We also require training to address an implicit bias and cultural competency that impact care and quality of care for patients of color, including women of color and people of color who can give birth during pregnancy and childbirth. In both PA and Ohio, there are not nearly enough protections mandating reasonable accommodations for pregnant workers. So in both PA and Ohio, abortion patients are subjected to laws that mandate coercive state directive counseling and a 24-hour waiting period before being able to access abortion care. And we all can say why that's definitely a negative and that we have to address those. So there are restrictions that prohibit and severely limit of abortion care under public insurance policies and under the Affordable Care Act. Also, minors must obtain parental consent to be forced to go before a judge to be deemed fit to make this decision. Both states have burdensome gestational limits on the books and forced clinics to meet burdensome standards and have nothing to do with health and safety of patients. We also are addressing the fake clinics of the crisis pregnancy centers in both states. They target Black women specifically and communities by offering coercive information that are intended to deter Black women from accessing abortion and getting a full range of information. What we know about the state polling, as well as our direct outreach to Black voters in Pennsylvania and Ohio, that a strongly majority of Black voters in both states and strongly support these. Now, regarding the progressive voting right policy in Pennsylvania, Black women reproductive champions like State Representative Johanna McClinton have been nevertheless introducing proactive solutions, such as fighting against racist prison gerrymandering, by bringing a resolution before the Legislative Reappointment Commission to ensure state prisoners will be counted at the address where they lived prior to being sentenced. And through certain provisions, the original resolution that passed in August has since been attacked again by conservative lawmakers. So Representative McClinton's resolution against prison gerrymandering is commendable and should be adopted by champions in other states as well. And we will continue to mobilize and advance this reform. And I'm gonna wrap it up by saying PA conservative legislators have sued for the 2020 election results, but it failed. Legislation was enacted in Pennsylvania to suppress voters, but Governor Wolf has vetoed it, which is great. And Ohio is currently working on redistricting and it looks like they're going to miss the deadline, but to get it implemented. So we're keeping a close eye on that. And Representative Amelia Sykes, who is a great RJ champion legislator, is working hard on these issues. So these are some of the things that we are working on. Oh yeah, but lastly, with Ohio, we see voter suppression laws, like I said earlier, by limiting ballot boxes accepted in local elections. They're shortening the window for requesting mail-in ballots and tightening voter requirements. So these are just some of the ways our work is very important.
Thank you so much, Carmen, for that overview. I now, just in the interest of time, want to open it up to question and answer from any of our viewers.
Hi, everyone. You can type your question and answer in the Q&A box. Your chat feature has been removed, so if you put your Q&A in that box, we can get them to our panelists. And Lexi, another option is that we could just reopen back up the chat if you'd like. And that way we could drop Lauren's items in there too.
Sure,
Okay.
sure. I see, let's see, I think I see it.
So I see one question. What are you doing to deal with crisis pregnancy centers?
I'll pass that to you, Carmen.
Yes, currently, as I said earlier, it's going on in both states, specifically in Pennsylvania. We're working around abortion clinics. We're involved with where offices in Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh, and specifically one opened up right down the street from our office, which is down the street from an abortion clinic. So we're working with them to expose them, to continue to educate our community on the importance of being able to make your own choice based upon your own lived experience. And also when we're part of cohorts where we are addressing and asking legislators to expose them for what they are. They're getting funding, state funding for their programs, and as if they're a medical community, but they're not. And so it's important that not only do we challenge them through state legislation, we also are educating our community through cohorts and working with other, like I said, abortion clinics, abortion funds, other reproductive health advocacy groups to continue to address this with our ground game also, because as we know, it's not just a one way to attack something like this. The opposition comes out of several ways, several levels. And so we have to be proactive, number one, in how we introduce this information and not as reactive, because it is not just like a coincidence that they're attacking voting and also our reproductive rights in the same vein, because they know how to tackle this. So we have to use a multifaceted approach also to combat and dismantle these type of policies and programs like the Crisis Pregnancy Center, because they only plant themselves in communities of color to miseducate us and to give us half the story of what can happen during our pregnancy. So it's our responsibility as an RJ advocacy group to expose them and to educate the truth about how to take care of our bodies. And while we build legislation to help give us access and to encourage legislators to invest into the healthcare and access like Medicaid to make sure that we have the access that we need to live a full and abundant life.
Thank you. And the questions are flying in now. So I want to, so that question came from Senator Janet Peterson in Iowa. The one thing that I wanted to just flag, Senator Peterson, that there is some legislation that has been introduced in other states, and we're happy to share some of that bill language with you to see if it would be effective in something like Iowa, and then also maybe connect you with other legislators in other states who have been working on crisis pregnancy center language as well. So happy to share some and make those connections, Senator Peterson. Okay, Lexi, another question for you. How do we keep people encouraged when there's so much effort to diminish and discourage people from the polls?
I
was gonna pass that one to you, Edwith. How do we keep folks encouraged?
I think there's a couple of things, right? Because if this question is from a state legislator, Lauren and Representative Schofield have also offered a lot of great suggestions of different activities that people can take. I think the reality is, like I said, when I was providing the landscape, like, yes, it's a dumpster fire, right? There's huge voter suppression bills cropping up all throughout the country. There's also abortion bans and restrictions cropping across the country. But what we've also seen is, like in Texas, they literally walked out and broke quorum and brought so much news and national engagement around what was happening within Texas when they were trying to pass a voter suppression bill there. And the same faction of people who drew up the voter suppression bill are also the same people who put together SB 8, which is the abortion ban, the egregious abortion ban that we're all probably aware of. And when that faction came to Texas, they rallied, they met with like senior committee staff members, they met with senators, they met with tons of people. There was also a huge sign-on letter with 500 state representatives and legislators who basically called out to put pressure on Congress. And as a state legislator, using your personal story, using your pulpit to really rally people and bring awareness and attention to these issues, I believe are great motivating factors. You can work with an organization like SIX, and also Center for American Progress has tons of resources as well. And I think that's one thing. As advocates, I think using your, doing relational organizing, connecting with organizations like Carmen's group, New Voices for Reproductive Justice, to really rally around people. I think we shouldn't have this defeatist mentality. Yes, this is a huge like Jim Crow moment. I am like so shocked to see a lot of this stuff come into play. But like some of the key policy solutions that I talked about on the federal level, like the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, like the Freedom to Vote Act and For the People Act, are really like, we're almost there. If we can continue to put pressure and move these bills forward on the national level, like the solutions are there. So I think those are great motivating factors to know that we're almost there, and to also acknowledge that this has been a difficult moment, right? Like in the present moment, we have been in a pandemic and we're all feeling that, but we also can't let up. Like the fight has to continue on, because we know that like losing this battle is even worse. So I hope that helps. I think there's a lot of different ways to encourage folks, but I think using your personal story, using your fight are great ways to do that. And I'll pass it over to Representative Schofield as well, who has her hand up.
Thank you. I think those are great suggestions. One of the things that I've learned just being, again, in the space of constituent engagement, community engagement, is that we have to talk with them and not for them. We have to talk, we don't talk about people. Why we don't see ourselves as power-based and influencers is because we are always talking above language that they don't understand. So part of the messaging is you have to make it baseline, real and personal, not just a personal story, but concentrate on what we have done. And we couldn't have done this if you stayed home. I try to kid them, if you stay home, this is what happens. Every area is impacted by your vote. And when you start to get in a language that they understand how it relates to them on a personal basis, not you vote because you're elected officials or to elect people, but your vote carries this much weight in housing, in the school systems, in healthcare, you've got to make it their personal story and see how it becomes personal and engaging. And that's where I've known is the needle in my community. So that's saying nobody's ever talked to me like that. No one ever put it that way, because they don't understand the John Lewis Voting Act. They don't understand. I don't care how many rallies and things that we do, until you talk with them about what matters most, they're going to still feel defeated. And feel like we can't. There are so many ways that we have been locked out of things in your job. But what did you do? Did you go home? Did you just take your marbles and go home and hope if I come back tomorrow, I have a job? No, you got mad, you got angry, and you did something. What did you do that last time that made you feel good? Like, oh my gosh, I did this and it worked. You have to start meeting people in the point of where it works. And so that we have great strategies, we have great execution. I just need us to scale that messaging now, that it relates to the person at the bus stop.
I know we are coming up on time. Lauren, I see your hand up. I'm wondering if folks are open to sharing. There are several questions in the chat now. If folks are open to sharing their contact information. If not, I'm happy to share mine. And for folks who didn't get their questions asked, we can make sure that our panelists get it back. If folks are open to, I would say, Lauren, I'm going to come to you first because they're wanting the 6 resources. And do you mind just sharing your contact information?
Yeah, I can share, and I know we're coming up on time, so I want you all to be able to get to another question, but just was going to say quickly that Representative Schofield and both Edwith put it so eloquently. It's really about recognizing that voices have power, and that's whether it's legislators or the voters. Both voices have power. And I think between our organizations or representatives like Representative Schofield, elevating those voices is important. And legislators help to elevate those voices for their communities. And organizations like SIX or even many other political organizations help to elevate the voices of those legislators that are trying to elevate the voices of those communities. And so it's just really important to meet the moment so you can move the needle. That's a really important thing to do because that's how we end up with lasting, not only progressive, but equitable change in communities. So just wanted to note that, but I will absolutely add that information to the chat.
So I just shared to Ashley in the Q&A. So if folks are trying to get in contact, have additional questions, there are 2 email addresses in the Q&A that you can reach out to us and we can connect you with Edwith and Carmen and Lexi so that you can get your questions answered. Lexi, I'm going to hand it back over to you because I know we're at the top of the hour.
Yes, I just want to thank everyone for your time today. Thank you again, Lauren, Rep. Schofield, Carmen, and Edwith for really helping us galvanize this conversation as a part of Black Reproductive Justice Week of Action. This is our 7th annual Week of Action. And we're just excited to see this work continuing to grow. I want to invite all of our attendees to visit, to follow at Black Women's RJ rather, to keep in touch with and follow the work of In Our Own Voice, National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda. And we will also make sure that all of the attendees today and all of the state legislators who are in our audience receive the Black RJ policy agenda because we want to make sure that this document can be used to help inspire and build strong coalition around proactive policy issues impacting the health and well-being of Black women, femmes, girls, and gender expansive folks in your states. So thank you for your time and continue to follow us and to help us share our Week of Action by using hashtag Hear Our Voices, RJWOA21. Thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.